Hello, my name is Kristen Jacobson, Professor of American Literature at Stockton University, and it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce this guest lecture, which is part of an ongoing exchange between Stockton University, located in southern New Jersey, and Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, Greece. While we look forward to the return of international travel and visits from international scholars, the Literature and American Studies programs in the School of Arts and Humanities is very happy to host this virtual lecture. Dr. Lydia Roupakia is an assistant professor of American literature and culture in the School of English at Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, Greece. She holds a PhD and a Master of Philosophy in English Studies from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Her PhD and Master of Philosophy research was funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council. Dr. Roupakia's prior teaching experience includes adjunct lecturing posts at the International Hellenic University. Herself a holder of triple citizenship, Greek, American, and Canadian, Dr. Lydia Roupakia has always been intrigued by questions surrounding identity and belonging. Her research interests focus on issues of multiculturalism in the Americas, identity construction and inter-American studies, cultural theory, and contemporary literature and ethics. Her publications include book chapters as well as essays published in the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Atlantis, Literature Interpretation Theory, University of Toronto Quarterly, and in other journals. She is also the co-editor of a volume of essays on religion and migration published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. Today, she will discuss the short story, New York Day Women.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Professor Christine Jacobson for inviting me to share some reflections on Edwidge Danticat's New York Day Women in the context of the class she teaches on contemporary American literature at Stockton University. I would also like to thank Stockton University and my home institution, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, for hosting this virtual exchange. Such initiatives strengthen cross-cultural dialogue and open up new spaces of interaction. The title of my talk is Narrative Remappings of Identity in Edwidge Danticat's New York Day Women. Edwidge Danticat has been a strong voice in the literary world since the publication of her first novel, Breath, Eyes, Memory, in 1995, when she was just 25 years old. Breath, Eyes, Memory received rave reviews and was followed by Crick Crack, a collection of short stories that was a finalist for the 1995 National Book Award. Danticat's remarkable early success made her a spokesperson for Haiti and its people. Subsequent to the selection of Breath, Eyes, Memory for the Opera Book Club in 1998, Danticat's storytelling power became the way a larger international audience learned about Haitian culture and history. In Paul Marshall's words, a silenced Haiti had once again found its literary voice. Danticat has continued to write both fiction and nonfiction, gaining recognition through prestigious awards such as the American Book Award in 1999, the National Book Critics Award for Autobiography in 2007, the National Book Critics Award for Fiction in 2020, to name just a few. Danticat has been referred to as a literary archaeologist for her ability to educate her readers by excavating, so to speak, narratives of genocide, loss, poverty, and displacement that have been silenced or distorted during Haiti's tumultuous political history. In Susana Vega Gonzalez's words, Danticat adheres to what Toni Morrison terms literary archaeology, a narrative strategy by which the writer excavates the historical past to rescue individual histories from oppression and oblivion. To quote from the epigraph to Danticat's short story collection Crick Crack, we tell the story so that the young ones will know what came before them. They ask crick, we say crack. Our stories are kept in our hearts. The title of the collection, Crick Crack, is a Haitian phrase used to introduce the practice of storytelling. The storyteller asks their audience, "Crick?" and they reply, "Crack," which shows their desire to listen to the story, and so the narration begins. Typically, the stories told during a crick-crack session tend to be light-hearted tales or riddles. Yet Danticat's collection confounds any such expectation through stories which feature poverty, loss, death, violence, rape, suicide, struggle, but also survival. The story I will be talking about today, New York Day Women, was published as part of the collection titled Crick Crack. In what follows, I will contextualize the story a bit and offer an argument that centers on questions of space and narrative remappings of identity, but which also echoes broader concerns regarding diaspora and intergenerational conflict. Crick Crack is a collection of 10 short stories, 9 stories and an epilogue, about Haitian women and their families trying to survive under the Duvalier dictatorships. The stories are linked together through one central concept: the relationships Haitian women have to their families, and especially their mothers and their country. Most of the stories are set in Port-au-Prince, in the fictional town of Ville-Rose. Edwidge Danticat has personal experience of the violence and trauma inflicted by the second Duvalier regime. She was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, in 1969. When she was 2 years old, her parents fled Haiti because of the oppressive dictatorship of François Duvalier. Danticat and her younger brother were unable to escape with their parents and were raised by their extended family. Thus, from an early age, Danticat was made aware of how Haiti's tumultuous political situation affected personal narratives. Edwidge Danticat and her brother eventually joined their parents in Brooklyn when she was 12. They lived in a Haitian-American neighborhood. To cope with the complexities of dislocation, Danticat turned to writing. Her personal story is one of success. She mastered English, graduated from Barnard College, received a Master of Fine Arts from Brown University, and became a renowned writer. Nevertheless, her work is dedicated to highlighting the lives of disenfranchised Haitian people, focusing on the historical legacy of trauma and violence, political and social injustice, struggle, and survival. In 2010, Danticat published a collection titled Create Dangerously: The Immigrant Artist at Work. Part essay, part memoir, the collection explores what it means to be an immigrant artist whose country of origin is in crisis. And I quote from Chapter 1, the introductory chapter. "So, though we may not be creating as dangerously as our forebears, though we are not risking torture, beatings, execution, though exile does not threaten us into perpetual silence, still, while we are at work, bodies are littering the streets somewhere." Time and circumstance may have allowed Danticat to escape the fates of her predecessors, who were enslaved, murdered, persecuted, or forced into poverty. But she does not escape, or does not renounce, such a cultural inheritance of loss, but rather she uses it as a motivational force in her writings. Lisa Ortiz offers the following quote from postcolonial theorist Trinity Minha as an epigraph to her essay on memory, loss, and cultural inheritance in Crick Crack, and I read, "In this chain and continuum I am but one link. The story is me, neither me nor mine." And I read further down, "No repetition can ever be identical, but my story carries with it their stories, their history, and our story repeats itself endlessly despite our persistence in denying it. I don't believe it. That story could not happen today. Then, some day, our children will speak about us here present, about those days when things like that could happen." The short story collection Crick Crack performs a geographic and genealogical mapping of both heritage and identity. The author's cultural history is interpreted through the imagined individual lives of her female ancestors. The collection articulates the woman-centered stories and legends of one family's oral history, handed down through its women throughout the past century of Haitian and Haitian American history. Danticats characters uncover oral histories almost obliterated by executions or massacres, political persecution and violence. Through repetition and mythic maternal connections, the sense of an ever-developing community of mothers and daughters holds the different voices together. Each story becomes a piece of an intricate pattern of complex maternal and cultural legacies. Out of this tapestry of interconnected stories about loss and trauma, violence and redemption, that answer to each other and reposition each other, New York Day Women stands out. New York Day Women is the penultimate story in the collection and, one may claim, strikes a rather discordant note with the rest of the stories. It stands out for its positive, even playful tone, as a story of accomplishment and empowerment. Its very title, New York Day Women, brings it in dialogue and in contrast with another story of the same collection that appears earlier in the sequence titled Night Women. Its brooding tone painting a stark world. I find New York Day Women particularly interesting because it performs a narrative inscription of Haitian American identity within the urban space of New York. And it brings the racialized female bodies to the center, claiming their active role in the construction of the urban fabric. In a collection of stories that foregrounds the persecution of human diversity, a story that presents the free urban movement of a marginalized character becomes political. In what follows, I will propose that Danticat's choice to narrate her character's mobility through city space performs their claims to citizenship and belonging. New York Day Women is narrated from a first-person point of view. Its effect on the reader builds up as the personalities of the two main characters, the Haitian mother and the Haitian American daughter, unfold through direct and indirect means of characterization. The story describes events as they are happening, in the present tense, and is focalized through the eyes of the narrator and daughter, Suzette. Today, and I read, walking down the street, I see my mother. She is strolling with a happy gait, her body thrust toward the "Don't Walk" sign and the yellow taxicabs that make 45-degree turns on the corner of Madison and 57th Street. The first words of the short story, "Today, walking down the street, I see my mother," describe the central activity that structures this story, the daughter's experience of walking in the streets of New York and seeing her mother. What follows, then, is a story about how, in the process of following her mother around in the city center, the narrator starts seeing her mother differently. The daughter's perception of who her mother is irrevocably changed. It is reconfigured through the mother's engagement with her urban surroundings as witnessed by her daughter. The narrator, Suzette, of Haitian origin, lives in New York with her family. When the story opens, Suzette is on her lunch break. She suddenly spots her mother in the streets of Manhattan, strolling with a happy gait, strutting down the street proudly, almost in a challenging manner, for we see, and I quote, her body thrust toward the "Don't Walk" sign. And I read further down. I have never seen her in this kind of neighborhood, peering into Chanel and Tiffany's and gawking at the jewels glowing in the Bulgari windows. My mother never shops outside of Brooklyn. She has never seen the advertising office where I work. She is afraid to take the subway, where you may meet those young militant street preachers who curse black women for straightening their hair. Why is Suzette surprised to see her mother strolling in downtown New York? Her mother is out of place in the posh streets of Manhattan. Her movement has been restricted to their Brooklyn neighborhood, something that brings her in contrast with Suzette, the daughter whose fashionable job in advertising locates her at the center of commerce and aligns her with the market and media economy. But there are more reasons that keep the mother's movement confined within the particular suburb where she resides. Fear of the subway is mentioned, and the reader at first imagines that the particular means of transport may be intimidating to an older immigrant woman, yet the mother's fears seem to be triggered by something else, by those young black militant street preachers who curse black women for straightening their hair. In other words, black militant youth who preach in favor of an essentialist identity politics that defines how one should lead their life in order to claim authentic black identity, and more specifically, how black women should lead their lives, how they should dress their bodies or wear their hair, what actions are worthy and what actions are cursed. Yet here she is, my mother, who I left at home that morning in her bathrobe, with pieces of newspapers twisted like rollers in her hair, my mother, who accuses me of random offenses as I dash out of the house. My mother is repeated 4 times in the first 3 paragraphs. The possessive pronoun in front of mother is repeated in almost every vignette that voices the daughter's thoughts as she pursues her mother throughout the city streets. The pronoun articulates the claims the daughter stakes on the mother, and the expectation that a person so close and familiar is knowable and known to the daughter she belongs to. This expectation is questioned and gradually challenged as the story unfolds. The opening scene of the story implies that the mother may be leading a double life, may have a character other than what has been taken for granted by the daughter thus far. Indeed, it becomes obvious that mother and daughter have been caught up in intergenerational conflict, where a polarizing she versus me has been created. Mother and daughter seem to have fallen in the same trap as essentializing strands of identity politics. My mother, who accuses me of random offenses as I dash out of the house. And that was the final sentence of the 3rd paragraph quoted there. This is a conflict zone between an older generation systematically finding fault with their offspring's choices and a younger generation who answer with flight and with an instinctive urge to escape from home and from the historical hauntings that bear upon private space. Reading the opening scene of New York Day Women brought to my mind an essay titled Political Belonging in a World of Multiple Identities by Jamaican-born cultural theorist Stuart Hall. In this essay, Hall observes that, and I quote, "For most of us, recognizing the importance of community and culture at the same time as acknowledging the liberal limit on communitarianism has involved a continued relationship to our family cultures." Stuart Hall further elaborates this comparison in the following way, and I quote, "You think they are tremendously important. You would not dream of being bound by them any longer. You prize the moment when you left them, but you know that as you leave them, they continue to support you. They continue to be what you are, they being our family cultures. You could not be what you are without that struggle both to defend them and to exit from them. So, though this is not a logical political position, it is actually an existential political position we all perfectly understand." End of quote. I believe Danticats New York Day Women articulates this existential political position. The story develops through a non-linear sequence of what may be described as short vignettes that follow the Haitian call and response format, which in fact, as I mentioned earlier, structures the entire short story collection Crick Crack. In New York Day Women, this call and response format takes the form of an exchange between Suzette's thoughts as she follows her mother around, and the mother's voice echoing in response in Suzette's head. And it looks something like this on the page. So Suzette's words are, "My mother, who accuses me of random offenses as I dash out of the house." To which the mother responds, "Would you get up and give an old lady like me your subway seat? In this state of mind, I bet you don't even give up your seat to a pregnant lady." The mother's words hold an implicit accusation of the, and I quote, "state of mind" her daughter is in. It is a state of mind that reflects what Stuart Hall earlier referred to as an existential political position, where one values family cultures, yet, according to Hall's words, would not dream of being bound by them any longer. Suzette replies in the following way: "My mother, who is often right about that. Sometimes I get up and give my seat, other times I don't. It all depends on how pregnant the woman is, and whether or not she is with her boyfriend or husband, and whether or not he is sitting down." Against her mother's absolute preachings regarding good and bad behaviors, Suzette posits a situational approach to ethics, to when and under what conditions, for instance, she would yield her seat to a pregnant woman. New York Day Women is full of examples of intergenerational conflict that often takes place within immigrant, diasporic, or multicultural contexts. The mother and daughter seem to draw on a different set of cultural values while they are expected to lead interdependent lives in shared domestic space. The call and response format that structures this story brings forth the sharp difference in opinion, belief, and value judgment between Suzette and her mother. At the same time, however, it creates a sense of what theorists refer to as relational autonomy. Relational autonomy is the term used to refer to a feminist critique of individual autonomy that explores new perspectives on human involvement and proposes ways of restructuring social and political practices with view of creating both just and caring societies. Recent feminist studies have suggested that the ethics built on the image of the self-sufficient, independent, rational individual largely overlook the reality of human vulnerability and interdependence. In Marilyn Friedman's words, and I quote, "Close relationships call for personal concern, loyalty, interest, passion, and responsiveness to the uniqueness of loved ones, to their specific needs, interests, history, and so on." End of quote. New York Day Women does not simply cast generations against each other, with the aim of highlighting the conflict between parental conservatism and a younger generation's openness to change. Positions are much more nuanced. In New York Day Women, the conflict between Suzette's need to invent herself anew and escape a cultural inheritance of loss on the one hand, and the mother's diasporic sense of identity on the other, becomes stridently apparent in the following scene, and I read mother's words first. "Why should we give to Goodwill when there are so many people back home who need clothes? We save our clothes for the relatives in Haiti." The daughter's response: 20 years we have been saving all kinds of things for the relatives in Haiti. I need the place in the garage for an exercise bike. To which the mother responds: "You are pretty enough to be a stewardess. Only dogs like bones." The mother's sense of identity is shaped by affective ties to a homeland elsewhere, and by feelings of responsibility and perhaps guilt towards those she has left behind. The mother's more community-oriented conception of identity comes into sharp contrast with the daughter's need to locate herself in her current surroundings, to make space for her own needs within the domestic space that she shares with her parents, and which has been shaped by the memory of Haitian relatives in need. It should be noted that the tone in this exchange is rather humorous. Indeed, the narrator's approach towards potentially painful intergenerational confrontations remains light-hearted throughout New York Day Women. Perhaps Danticat intended this particular story as a short respite between the tales of pain and loss recounted in Crick Crack. Humor saves New York Day Woman from succumbing to rupture and fragmentation. The vignettes that follow the call and response format may disrupt a formal sense of cohesion, yet the effective power that permeates the text binds the female voices through what could be called a relational ethics, an ethics of care. Suzette is the inheritor of stories about a homeland where being female also meant lack of access to education, and I read, "My mother, who taught herself to read as a little girl in Haiti from the books that her brothers brought home from school," and a homeland which has already brought 6 of Mother's 7 sisters to their grave, a presumably dangerous place for women, a homeland that has become a shrine for lost female ancestors, and I read again, "My mother, who has now lost 6 of her 7 sisters in Villerose, and has never had the strength to return for their funerals. Many graves to kiss when I go back, many graves to kiss." Yet, in New York Day Women, Danticat is not interested in redefining a particular historical legacy or in resurrecting myths of common ancestry. Rather, the story can be read as an engagement with the effects of an inheritance of loss on second-generation Haitian Americans. Familiar and intimate relationships are foregrounded as important social loci where contemporary conflicts of value or interest arise in the everyday lives of ordinary characters in a multicultural urban context, such as New York. In New York Day Women, Danticat explores a more American-born conception of individuality and belonging through a close scrutiny of the 2 protagonists' ethical negotiations, which resonate with social and political implications. It is a story that shows how immigration and social changes at the end of the 20th century are transforming Haitian women's approaches to questions of belonging. The daughter's care for her mother and vice versa are systematically noted throughout this short story, albeit in non-linear ways. Suzette uses her break to follow her mother around Manhattan, making sure she is safe. She worries that her mother may be hit by a cyclist, and I quote, "As she heads towards the Plaza Hotel, a bicycle messenger swings so close to her that I want to dash forward to rescue her. But she stands dead in her tracks and lets him ride around her, and then goes on. And she worries that her mother may be consuming too much salt. This mother of mine," I read again, "she stops at another hot dog vendor's and buys a frankfurter that she eats on the street. I never knew that she ate frankfurters. With her blood pressure, she shouldn't eat anything with sodium. She has to be careful with her heart, this Day Woman." And she recalls her mother's words, "I cannot just swallow salt. Salt is heavier than 100 bags of shame." Likewise, the mother has Suzette in mind while she enjoys some window shopping. And I read, "I can tell that she's looking at an African print dress, contemplating my size." And the final vignette of the story stresses the breadth of the mother's care and understanding. And I read again, starting with Suzette's thoughts, "My mother, who never went to any of my parent-teacher association meetings when I was in school." To which her mother answers, "You're so good anyway. What are they going to tell me? I don't want to make you ashamed of this Day Woman. Shame is heavier than 100 bags of salt." The mother may have the cultural knowledge and prowess to manipulate Haitian proverbs in her favor in this apparent intergenerational war about what a good life entails. And note how the proverb is tactfully flipped at the end of the story. Yet The mother reaches across this apparent rift in a desire to protect her daughter from the burden of shame, and in this case the burden of being ashamed of her own mother. In what follows, I would like to propose that Danticat's approach towards familiar and intergenerational relationships in New York Day women is indicative of the transformations taking place both in the private sphere in terms of relational autonomy, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in public space. One may argue that changes in the private and public realm are inextricably intertwined. As the daughter pursues her mother through the streets of Manhattan, the mother-daughter relationship is reshaped through the mother's contact with the city's social and cultural materialities, a contact which is witnessed and read by the daughter. This act of rereading the mother, this day woman, within a new urban context is experienced by Suzette as a reorientation towards everything mother stands for to that point. Suzette's narrative maps her mother's trajectory through downtown New York. As the mother travels through urban space, she resignifies that very space and is affected by it. In this way, the daughter's interpretation of her mother's identity is forever changed. Drawing on the concepts of the right to the city by Henri Lefebvre, subsequently expanded by David Harvey in 2012, and the theory of pedestrian enunciation by Michel de Certeau, I would like to propose that in New York Day Women, the author negotiates the right to the city of immigrant gendered bodies by narrating the mother's geographic and symbolic movement in downtown New York. Henri Lefebvre's 1968 study, The Right to the City, claimed that changing reality involved the right of citizens to claim their own urban social space and fight against spatial inequalities. According to Lefebvre, the city is public and should be the space for social interactions and exchanges. The city also demands heterogeneity between different cultures and subjectivities and should be reclaimed as a co-created space. In 2012, David Harvey expanded on the same concept. Among other things, he explained that capitalist forms of government have, through the decades, promoted unjust geographies which make urbanism a class phenomenon. Harvey sees the right to the city not as a right that already exists, but as a collective struggle by all those that have a part in producing the city and creating the life in it, to claim the right to decide what kind of urbanism they want. Recent feminist criticism has argued that the concepts developed by Lefebvre and Harvey fail to include the perspectives of women in their definition and analysis. For instance, Tove Fenster, in her article The Right to the Gendered City, Different Formations of Belonging in Everyday Life, argues that Lefebvre and Harvey's concepts are not sensitive to collective differences, do not challenge ethnic, racial, or gendered power relations. Through interviews, Fenster discovered that in order to understand the real restrictions of females in the streets, we need to first look at what they experience at home, if they are allowed and supported to have a public life. In New York Day Women, for instance, Suzette implies that she herself never imagined her mother outside the boundaries of domesticity, and in her way never encouraged the possibility that her mother have a public life. And I read, "My mother, whom I have always bought household appliances for on her birthday, a nice rice cooker, a blender. And yet, here is mother walking the street confidently with a happy gait," and I quote, "as if she has lived in New York her entire life." In New York Day Women, the mother's low-income immigrant black female body in an African print flower dress is represented as traveling, mapping, and ensuring her belonging on sidewalks and urban public space, surrounded by men and women in suits and trendy clothing. Mother's passage through the city is narrated as a fascinating trajectory of many possibilities, and I quote, "I follow my mother, mesmerized by the many possibilities of her journey." End of quote. Suzette's mother walks by the corner of Madison and 57th Street, peers into Chanel and Tiffany's and the Bulgari stores, stands in front of Carnegie Hall, heads towards the Plaza Hotel, stops at a corner hot dog stand, stops at another vendor selling sundresses, and finally enters the park. The mother, whose experience as a member of the lower social classes in relation to elites in Haiti is stridently captured in the following excerpt. In Haiti, when you get hit by a car, the owner of the car gets out and kicks you for getting blood on his bumper. This mother, with the red orchids in her dress and the heavy faux leather bag, keeps on walking as though she owns the sidewalk under her feet. Suzette's mother walks confidently, as if she has lived in New York her entire life. She interacts easily with vendors, and she seems to have developed a trusting relationship with the child she babysits and his mother. And I read, "The woman kisses the child goodbye and surrenders him to my mother. The child given to my mother has frizzy blonde hair. His hand slips into hers easily, like he's known her for a long time. When he raises his face to look at my mother, it is as though he is looking at the sky. My mother gives this child the soda that she bought from the vendor. The child's face lights up. This seems to be a conspiracy just between the two of them." Suzette's mother is recognized as a respected and trustworthy member of the urban social fabric, a day woman who is trusted with the care of the white American woman's child. For Edward Soja and his 2010 study Seeking Spatial Justice, making geographies always starts with occupancy, with bodily presence and the performance of the self in the public sphere. The mother in New York Day Women marks her own presence as a co-constructor of the urban fabric through the negotiations she develops with social others inhabiting shared urban space. In this way, urban space shapes and is shaped by the trajectory of the mother's marginal body, and the act of claiming this process becomes political. An idea that could help us understand the politics of movement is the idea of pedestrian enunciation proposed by Michel de Certeau in his study The Practice of Everyday Life. Certeau states that the act of human passage becomes a process of appropriation and transformation of space. And I read, "The act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is to language or to the statement uttered. It thus seems possible to give a preliminary definition of walking as a space of enunciation." End of quote. As people see and are seen on common ground, they become more aware and accepting of diversity and inclusion. Suzette's mother walks in central Manhattan and engages with her surroundings. In the process, she has an impact both on local citizens, the white woman and her child, the vendors, for instance, and other immigrants, the immigrant ladies she has befriended in the park, for instance, and on her own daughter who bears witness on the mother's urban identity. In this way, New York Day Women becomes a narrative about making difference visible and breaking from symbolic oppression. In his 2002 study, Walkscapes, Walking as an Aesthetic Practice, Francesco Carreri defends walking as a social disorder or a person's active resistance to hierarchy structures that impose geographical restrictions. When we walk, we accumulate knowledge and power over a territory, developing our sense of belonging or ownership. Danticat's narrative remapping of New York, through a text that narrates transit and territorial knowledge, performs the right of previously marginalized characters to access as well as shape the society and the city spaces in which they are inserted. The mother's walk through the city in New York Day Women is not narrated as a space of marginality and decay, but instead as a trajectory of possibilities. The mother is on an optimistic urban journey where she observes, discovers, negotiates successfully, interacts. She's an active, recognized part of the social fabric. The narration of her journey through the city has an impact on Suzette, her own daughter. By the end of the narrative, Suzette recognizes in her mother a woman that does not succumb to the marginal status assigned to her, but rather actively engages in rewriting the narrative of the city through her visibility. And I read, "Day women come out when nobody expects them. Tonight, on the subway, I will get up and give my seat to a pregnant woman or a lady about Ma's age." Suzette will hand over her seat in a sign of this recognition. It is proof that Suzette herself has been changed after witnessing her mother, this day woman that has come out when nobody expected her, negotiate urban spatial relations that imply social and cultural relations. Danticat plays with the ideas of recognition and misrecognition, two concepts that have been widely used in discussions of cultural difference. In his seminal essay, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Recognition, Canadian political philosopher Charles Taylor argued that, and I quote, "Our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others. And so, a person or a group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or the society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves." Suzette here admits that her understanding of her own mother, and the emphasis on the possessive pronoun appears throughout the text, was limiting and distorting. Her previous understanding of who her own mother is was an act of misrecognition, and this admission opens her up towards uncertainty, towards an acknowledgement of the possibility that perhaps one day I would chase an old woman down a street by mistake, and that old woman would be somebody else's mother, who I would have mistaken for mine. Uncertainty is the first step towards an ethical opening up towards otherness, even the otherness embodied by one's own intimately familiar mother. A question lingers in the reader's mind at the end of the story. Why doesn't Suzette go up to her mother and speak to her? Why doesn't she reveal her presence? Instead, she goes into great lengths to keep her presence secret, almost as if she is spying on her mother, or even stalking her. I follow my mother, mesmerized. I trail the red orchids in her dress. Realizing the ferocious pace of my pursuit, I stop against the wall to rest. She is slowing her pace, and now I am too close. If she turns around, she might see me. I let her walk into the park before I start to follow again. I wait and watch from a corner. I turn around and start to walk out of the park before my mother can see me. I stand behind the bus and take a peek at my mother in the park. Would Ma have said hello had she been the one to see me first? This sustained silence and secrecy is perhaps an act of respect performed by the daughter towards the mother, much like the mother's earlier refusal to attend parent-teacher association meetings so as to spare her daughter any embarrassment. If anything, the secrecy shows that the cultural memory of a homeland elsewhere and of a history of loss which the mother struggles to impart to her daughter seem to come in conflict with this image of the immigrant mother as a mobile urban dweller. Indeed, the daughter's trained silence, which is infused with feelings of guilt and embarrassment at having exposed the mother's secret life, most potently shows that historical legacies of loss and trauma, like the one Suzette's Haitian mother carries, still strike a discordant note when considered alongside urban hybrid lifestyles, and are far from integrated or accepted as constitutive narratives of the metropolitan cultural fabric. And now I would like to offer a few concluding remarks. Recent geographic empowerment of minorities, new mobilities, and exchange of information through social media are having an impact on how people who cross borders are perceived. Edwidge Danticat's writing does not only commemorate a history of trauma and violence. In New York Day Women, Danticat chooses to place her Haitian and Haitian American characters in the center of New York. She allows them free movement that signals a fluidity of social hierarchies and borders. If stories, testimonies, and narratives have a transformative potential, it is because they allow us to see the other and to share perspectives and life experiences that are not similar to ours. In this light, Edwidge Danticat's New York Day Women stands out for it invites reflection on the complex relationship between narrative engagement, intimate relationship, spatial politics, and the possibility of conversation about values across difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roupakia, for this insightful close reading of the story. I hope that those of you who are viewing this lecture will post your comments to the lecture in the comment section, and I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.